It's an honor and a privilege to present Ron Shandler for the FSWA Hall of Fame, an honor he so richly deserves. The only regret Ron has with this honor right now is that he really wishes it was called the Fanalytics Hall of Fame. When you look over Ron's body of work in this industry, which spans almost 3 decades, you realize how deserving he really is for this honor and why he is such a slam-dunk choice for this Hall of Fame. Remember, Ron first published The Forecaster in 1986. That was just 2 years after Glenn Wagner published the Rotisserie Baseball Guide. And really only 6 years after rotisserie baseball was invented. He was into baseball analysis long before fantasy baseball really took off. In 1986, Ron was a market forecasting analyst for a publishing company outside of Boston. He enjoyed analyzing baseball data and felt he could project baseball stats as well as anyone else. This was baseball analytics well before anyone else got into it. The Forecaster was born that year, and he continued to work full-time for the next 8 years as a market forecasting analyst while writing and projecting for the Forecaster. Then in 1994, he made his best prediction ever. As Ron told me, 2 weeks before the baseball strike, in 1994, I told my wife, I'm quitting my day job to do this full-time. Don't worry, honey, they'll never go out on strike. His girls were only 2 and 4 at the time. And in fact, Sue, his wife, is here, and one of his daughters. I want them to stand up to be recognized. Ron, your daughter's making it. Okay. Come on, Sue, stand up. His girls were only 2 and 4 at the time that he made that decision. But he made the move that would change his career and his life. Sure, Major League Baseball went on strike and proved Ron wrong. But eventually they returned, and with it came the internet, a vehicle that none of us who started out in our careers in the 1980s could have ever imagined would take this industry to new heights. Ron dove into the internet early with BaseballHQ.com and has never looked back. Through 26 years of writing, Ron has become well known in MLB circles because of the Forecaster. He even worked for an MLB team for a time. He writes a weekly fantasy column for USA Today. He has advanced the writing careers of dozens of baseball fanatics who write for Baseball HQ. And he was even a star character known as the Bearded One in the book and movie Fantasyland. One day I'd like to be known as the Mustachioed One. But even if nobody ever refers to me as that, I do know that Ron and I are graduates of the 70s. And we love our bad facial hair and we'll keep it till we die. No matter what you guys say. It's tough to minimize 26 years of work in an industry that has been around only 32 years. Ron, you truly are an industry pioneer, a leader in the baseball space, and someone who many of us look up to. And in your honor, for the next 15 minutes, this industry will be known as the Fanalytics baseball industry. Congrats, my friend, and enjoy this fine honor.
You don't know how hard it was for Greg to get up here and say nice things about me, given that I'm a New York Giants fan.
Oh, yeah.
Still in shock. What can I say? Great Yahoo. Gosh, no. When I started writing, Pete Rose was still a national treasure. I don't know, maybe this is just about my longevity, having done this for so long, but even though I've been doing this for 26 years, there are people who came before me who really paved the way, and I'd really like to spend my few allotted minutes here to talk about those folks who I am indebted to, and all the reason I'm standing here today. And the first one has to be, from my perspective, it all started with Dan Okrent and Glenn Wagner. Okrent may not have invented fantasy sports or fantasy gaming, but he did invent what became the most commercially viable version of fantasy sports in rotisserie. But when you think about it, all that he did was create a set of rules. And for those of us who know that in our fantasy leagues, it all starts with a firm league constitution We also know that Constitution is probably the most boring, complicated, arcane, convoluted piece of writing on the planet. But Glenn Wagner, what he did is he took that, and he was the one who actually crafted the prose in Rotisserie League Baseball back in 1984, and made it so that you would read that book and crave to have that experience that those guys had in that book. And for me, I actually found that book and Bill James' Abstract the same summer of 1984, and that's really what turned it around for me. But that book, that green book, I don't know, anybody here still have that green book? Raise your hand, you still have that green book? I mean, it's the Bible. And that's where it all started. I also wouldn't be here if not for Alex Patton, who was the first regular writer in this space. He starting in 1988, he wrote 9 books on rotisserie pricing and valuation. Another really boring topic. But Alex was an English professor, and he crafted this book in such a way that was engaging to the reader. He was a master of writing dialogue. And this conversation between him and the reader just drew you in and turned also a very boring topic into something that was fun and interesting. And Alex referred to my work several times in some of his books. It was the first time I had gotten exposed to the public through him. So I appreciate what Alex did for me from that perspective. Who else? Some of you might think this is kind of odd, but I also would not be here if not for John Benson, who in the early to mid-1990s, his byline appeared virtually everywhere. He wrote books, newsletters, ran a magazine for a few years. He was the first weekly columnist for Baseball Weekly. He had probably the most popular 900 line that wasn't porn. But then, by the same token, we probably would refer to him as the first fantasy media whore, because he was just everywhere. John and I didn't get along. We didn't see eye to eye on virtually anything, for that matter. And sometimes it got kind of nasty, and we got lawyers involved. But every time we had our flame wars in print, my readership spiked. And for that reason alone, it's just further proof that there's no such thing as bad publicity. The next, actually, weekly columnist for Baseball Weekly was John Hunt, who was also, I think, a very important writer in this space. John, probably in the mid-1990s, was probably the most widely read fantasy writer. Baseball Weekly went to circulation of like 300,000 back then. Everyone hung on his words every Wednesday in that newspaper. But I think John's major accomplishment and biggest impact for me was that he created the first experts league. The League of Alternative Baseball Reality Labor back in 1994. It was the first published experts league, and I got to play against people like Bill James and Keith Olbermann. And I would have won that league too if not for the baseball strike in '94, because I was in first place for all of June and July, and then first week in August I dropped to third, and then a week and a half later the players went on strike, and that was that. But John, I mean, he created that league and gave a lot of writers their first major exposure to this industry, myself included, so I owe him a debt of gratitude for that. Even though I created Tout Wars several years after that, strictly because I thought that the control and ownership of these experts leagues should rest with the people who participated in them. But John was the one who kind of started that all. There were other people as well. I mean, Steve Mann was a baseball insider, wrote the Mann-Mallon fantasy baseball guide for several years, mentioned me in his book several times, which also gave me some more exposure. Lenny Melnick and Erwin Zwilling, the first fantasy baseball radio guys. I was on their show several times in the early 1990s. So these guys, I mean, sort of set the path for me and paved the way for me to be where I am today. Fantasy baseball writing has come a real long way since the 1980s and 1990s. But I think we still have a ways to go. When you think about it, it's taken nearly 3 decades for us to finally be getting to the point where we're given the respect that are given to mainstream writers. From my perspective, I think we're better than mainstream writers. We analyze the news better, we evaluate talent better. We're far more in touch with our readers. So I still think there's a ways to go. And if I had two wishes for this industry right now, the first one would be that I want to see the day when the major media doesn't treat fantasy as a separate entity. You can have your own page over here and your own staff and your own writers. We are good and we deserve better than that. We should be assimilated and integrated into the entirety of sports media. And the second thing I'd like to see is that I don't think it should take for us to be hired into major league organizations to be considered successful. And no offense, Jason, but I think you were plenty successful writing for ESPN. I think what we do is important, and having done this for basically virtually my entire career at this point, I think what we do is very, very important, and we should be proud of what we do. And as for me, as far as what constitutes success for me, I'm just a stat geek from Flushing, Queens, who wanted to make some bucks, enough money from his hobby to pay the mortgage, put his children through college, and I guess for that win, I did accomplish that. But I appreciate this honor. I appreciate what the FSWA does, and I thank you for listening.
Okay, to introduce David Dodds, Joe Brown.